there isn't a budget emergency and there isn't a debt crisis. Australia's debt at about, government debt at about 14% of GDP is a fraction of the OECD average of over 70% at the moment. And there hasn't been an explosion in spending. The deficit that we do have is almost entirely a result of a collapse in revenues, part of which came out of the end of the mining boom, and the other half was really the fact that we were giving away the cash that we were getting through the mining boom through massive tax cuts implemented by both the Howard and Rudd governments. And given that that's the problem, it is particularly remarkable that this budget sets out to reduce tax income. That's one of the things that Tony Abbott boasts about. This reduces taxes. And you might be surprised that it's reducing taxes, given you've heard quite a lot about the high income levy and the extra tax on fuel. So what are the taxes that they're getting rid of? Well, they're getting rid of a large corporate tax called the mining tax. They're getting rid of another large corporate tax called the carbon tax, and then another large corporate tax called the company tax, all of which are going to be cut, and all of which primarily fall on large and to some extent medium-sized businesses. So that's where they're getting rid of the revenue to create an even larger hole that they then try to fill somewhat inexpertly by slashing and burning things. And they don't really make up almost any of that revenue. So the real message from this is, even in trying to cut revenue, this budget's not about trying to balance the budget. It's actually about trying to widen inequality and destroy public services. That's its primary purpose. And it's actually near impossible to understand the budget if you think it's trying to do anything else. So how is it attacking that social contract? Well, it's reducing a whole range of payments, which means that, for example, a single parent with a 6-year-old, if people have been reading Peter Martin, will lose about 10% of their income, household income, while a couple without kids on $360,000 a year won't lose anything. It cuts family payments, it cuts pensions, it introduces some of the most remarkably draconian measures on young unemployed people, which I'm sure we'll hear about a little bit later. It also changes indexation, which is much less sexy, but I think goes to the heart of the philosophy of the budget. At the moment, we index a number of payments to reflect the broad community standard of wages. That is, they're supposed to keep up with broad community expectations. We're now going to index them to the cost of living. Not their cost of living, because we know that their cost of living is greater than the total cost of living, because Kevin Rudd introduced a new measure to try and index the pension. And we know that that's the measure that more often applies to the pension than the lower CPI. That's because the costs that pensioners face and single parents face, things like rent and utilities, go up faster than the rest of the prices in the economy. So this is essentially, at best, an anti-poverty measure, but it is deliberately a pro-inequality measure. It is designed to widen the gap between those at the bottom and average wage earners. That's the definition of what they're doing. They're trying to shift the payments from something that does keep up with wage earners to something that deliberately doesn't.
Look, this is a budget that has deliberately divided the nation, and we heard that already tonight from Ben. But I think it doesn't hurt to restate the deliberate nature of it and the deliberate division of a nation, and the way the government expects that by saying things like we're freezing politicians' pay for a year, or we're putting a temporary deficit levy on people who earn more than $150,000 or $180,000, that will get emotional buy-in from the whole nation, as though we're all sharing the burden. And it was interesting, I had the opportunity to hear from the Treasurer today, Joe Hockey, at a lunch in Parliament House. And I think that the head of the Australian Council of Services, Cassandra Goldie, really nailed him very well, because he was talking about the emotional pain and the angst that he'd had from putting the deficit levy on and freezing politicians' pay increases. She said that it isn't about emotional sharing, it's about fair economic sharing and participation in the economic life and the society that we live in. And I think that she really nailed that very well. I actually wanted to start tonight talking about a right-wing commentator who's called Nikki Savard, that some of you might know about, and also, of course, the Treasurer that I've started. And you might wonder why I mentioned Nikki Savard. She used to be the Public Relations Officer for both Peter Costello and John Howard. She's brought out now to be a right-wing commentator. I heard her most recently on The Insiders. And I thought what she had to say was quite, the Inside is the show on the ABC, for those who haven't seen. And it was interesting because they were discussing the politics of getting the Medicare co-payment through the Senate. And what she said was, well, you know, there'll be a bit of negotiation here and they'll knock the payment down a bit here and they'll put out some more concessions and there'll be some more exemptions. But at the bottom of the line, when they get the deal through the Senate, they will have achieved their principle. And so all of the debate about whether a person on a pension concession card gets 10 times free or, you know, no times free or they pay, none of that is at all relevant. What's relevant is, as you all know, the principle of breaking universal health care. And it was just clear from her what she had to say. Now, I also had the opportunity, as I said, to hear the Treasurer, and it's not just universal health care, it's the social security safety net, it's the role of government, as we've also heard tonight here from Christopher. For example, the role of government seems no longer to collectively take risk for us, but it is about pushing risk back onto each and every individual, no matter where they stand in society. I always felt that the role of government was that collective sharing of risk. It's about deregulating the labour market and the jobs market and commodifying education. And what was very interesting about what the Treasurer had to say was, and we are doing it in the name of creating jobs.
For anyone that's getting restless, I'll give a kind of 10-second version of what I'm about to say, which is that this budget moves us in the opposite direction to where we need to be headed in environmental terms. So it moves us further away from what the science is telling us needs to be done to tackle climate change and to tackle environmental destruction. And it does so while widening inequality. I want to make 3 main points in my talk today. The first point is that this budget weakens or kills the institutions that are helping us deal with climate change. Now, world governments have committed to trying to keep climate change within 2 degrees. And as this quote from Thomas Stocker shows, we have to make cuts now, deep, urgent cuts, if we're going to have any chance of staying in the 2-degree goal. And the Australian government says that it's still committed to doing its bit to help us stay within the 2-degree goal. But this budget makes that promise look very empty, and Australia is already far from pulling its weight globally. So, for starters, the expenditure on the government's so-called direct action climate policy will be capped, regardless of whether we even meet our 5% reduction goal by 2020. The Australian institutions that help us understand and act on climate change have all been weakened or killed. Funding for the CSIRO, the Bureau of Meteorology, has been reduced, the Australian Climate Change Science Program has been amalgamated, and the Climate Change Authority, as we all know, is already on death row. And this is probably one of the most important things, that the programs and institutions that were helping Australia be part of the solution to climate change have also been cut. So the Australian Renewable Energy Agency has been abolished. And this follows the introduction of legislation to abolish the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and it follows the current review of the renewable energy target. And that renewable energy target is the single policy driver behind reducing Australia's emissions right now. And that review into the renewable energy target is being headed by Dick Warburton, the climate skeptic. Now, I'm not saying that there's going to be any lack of impartiality in that review. I'm not making that allegation at all. And that's not it. Australia's promised to do our bit to stop the world's remaining rainforests being destroyed, especially next door in Indonesia. And this is a picture of Kalimantan rainforest in Indonesia. Globally, deforestation contributes about 12% to global emissions, and it also drives many plant and animal species extinctions. So here's the same area, Kalimantan, after some deforestation. Now, Australia has previously made significant commitments to tackling deforestation. For example, the International Forest Carbon Initiative was given about $273 million in 2008. All that funding is gone in this budget. And a lot of that money came from the aid budget, which we know is the single biggest budget saving measure in this budget, and talking about taking from those who need it the most. Instead, there's $800,000 from this government to run a conference at which they will try and convince other governments that they should do something about deforestation. So that was my first point. The second point is that this budget makes life easier for the coal companies and the other fossil fuel companies that we talk of at Greenpeace as the climate makers, so those who are driving climate change for their own profit. Now, this is obviously bad from the perspective of fairness and democratic equality, because at the same time the budget's making life a lot harder for those who can least afford it. But it's also bad from an environmental perspective, because fossil fuel, and specifically producing and exporting coal, is Australia's biggest contribution to global climate change. And burning coal that was produced and exported from Australia in the last year created more carbon pollution than the whole of Australia's emissions domestically put together. And just to give one example of how this plays out in practice, there's a huge coal mine before Environment Minister Greg Hunt at the moment, called the Carmichael Mine in Queensland. Greg Hunt has it on his desk at the moment for approval. And when the coal from that mine is burnt, it will produce more emissions than will be saved under the whole direct action policy till 2020, and that's on its best possible estimates.